Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. I'm your host, Victor, and on this podcast, we are normally watching some current TV series week to week. Currently watching Alien Earth. This week's episode, the penultimate episode of the season, is called Emergence. Also on the podcast, covering the very popular HBO Max series, Task. We just dropped the recap episode of that second episode of that series just a couple days back. I'm usually joined on these Alien Earth recaps by my co-host Darren. But tonight I actually have the school open house that I'll be attending with my wife and other parents. And it's occurring right when I would normally be recording with Darren. But he will definitely be back next week for the finale. Also stay tuned. We will have coverage of a bunch of series that are premiering soon. The Lowdown on FX, a new comedic conspiracy thriller starring Ethan Hawke. The Savant, an FBI thriller starring Jessica Chastain on Apple TV+. Also on Apple TV+, Slow Horses is coming back next week. And Peacemaker will be wrapping up within the next few weeks, and I'll probably have a season recap of that series as well. Plus a whole bunch of movies will be premiering in the next couple of months leading up to awards season. So expect my reviews along the way. Oh, and of course, this week, new on Netflix, yet another thriller, Black Rabbit, starring Jason Bateman and Jude Law, which I also plan to watch and hopefully give you a review of that as well. So lots of stuff to come. The backlog of the writer's strike has now created a logjam, from backlog to logjam, and I'll be watching the content I'm interested in and hopefully bring you along the way with me. Make sure you subscribe so you know when those episodes become available. And if you ever have any feedback for the show, feel free to email me, needssomeintroduction@gmail.com, or post a comment on Spotify if you're listening to us on Spotify or on YouTube. Since my solo episodes always go way shorter than when I have a co-host, a few topics I'll dig into here before we get into the breakdown. First of all, I saw The Long Walk, the Stephen King adaptation. For anyone who's not familiar, Stephen King, this is the first book he actually wrote, even before Carrie, but he published it later. He published it under a different name, Richard Bachman, and he published a few of these books under this other name, one of them being The Running Man, another reality show set dystopian future where people fight for money or death. The world we live in now, basically. So he wrote this back in the 70s. It was published in the early 80s. The Running Man, at some point it was discovered that he was the writer. He republished them with Stephen King as the name, and the books became much more popular. The Running Man has been adapted previously, and we're getting another Running Man version this year, directed by Edgar Wright, starring Glenn Powell, and an all-star cast that features Coleman Domingo as the game host, Michael Cera, always fun to see him, and Emilia Jones, who we're watching currently on Task, killing it on Task right now. Lee Pace as well, like an all-star cast, and it's going to be a big blockbuster. But before we get there, we have The Long Walk, a much smaller budgeted dystopian future. In this case, the whole movie and the whole premise is that these boys, one from each state, simply walk until there's only one person left. They have to keep a certain pace, and that's it. That's the whole film. This is beyond a civil war in the United States. It's an annual event that is supposed to speak to the can-do-it spirit of old America. So there's a lot that you can apply in this metaphor. It's about growing up. It's about, you make friends, you have to leave them behind inevitably. Everybody deals with that in a different way. There's different philosophical perspectives represented by these boys and the relationships that form between them. It's a very emotionally powerful film. It works very well. The ending is not the strongest point, maybe the weakest point of the film. Also, probably the weakest point of the book itself. Interestingly, this is made by Francis Lawrence, a much more low-budget version of yet another dystopian future. He's, of course, made multiple Hunger Games movies and now the Hunger Games prequel series as well. So he's made quite a career of this, like 10 years or more of making these dystopian films. And I think he's making that sequel to the prequel to the Hunger Games now as well. So it keeps going. But well made. That's the whole setup. Darren actually saw this as well and was surprised, not familiar with the book. that the whole story is just basically, that's it. You're just walking with the kids. He thought there might be some kind of framing device where you're watching people watching them. When I was texting with him, I mentioned that, no, that's how the book is. You are literally embedded with these kids. It's, of course, embedded, speaking of that, also a metaphor for a bunch of kids joining a military cause, for example, and then getting in or believing that, well, there's no way that I'm not going to survive this, and then slowly making the revelation that this is inevitable, that death is inevitable. Of course, Stephen King was writing this in the mid-'70s, during the Vietnam War, the end of the Vietnam War. So that definitely was on his mind, I presume, as well. But it still has metaphor resonance today. You think about the idea of this like hustle culture, like if you're not succeeding, it's because you're not trying hard enough. And then, of course, this that as a metaphor for, in the end, only one person can survive anyway, regardless of how hard you hustle. So it has some resonance. It's I was about to say it's a good time. It's not a good time. This is a downbeat story for sure. Terrific performances. Cooper Hoffman from Licorice Pizza, again, really charismatic. And David Johnson as well, who had a breakout last year in Alien Romulus, speaking of, we're talking about Alien in this particular episode. And of course, in Industry, the HBO series previous to that as well. Mark Hamill is this fascistic figurehead here who attends these long walks as well. He's fine, not the highlight of the show, but really not his story anyway. He's been in so many Stephen King adaptations now because of his connection to Mike Flanagan and all of his Stephen King adaptations, including a Carrie series coming to Amazon Prime, and Mark Hamill will be in that one as well. Okay, topic number 2. Robert Redford just passed away just a couple of days ago at 89. I was surprised he didn't last a little longer. I mean, he seemed to be very healthy. I mean, he was still acting until nearly the end of his life. And I did want to mention him for a couple of reasons. So starting last year, I was just kind of going through my back catalog of blind spots and my things I haven't seen enough of. And one of those things wasn't Robert Redford. It was actually Paul Newman. But of course, as I was rewatching a bunch of Paul Newman stuff, I intersected, of course, with Robert Redford's career. They're maybe two biggest hits for both of them, or they start together in films. But it made me think about stars like Paul Newman and like Robert Redford, and especially Newman, I have to say, because of the fact that in watching HUD, for example, which I'd never seen before, in watching Cool Hand Luke, which I had not seen since I was very young, like on TV when I was like 11 or something, and of course appreciating it significantly more now, it did make me think about like, who do we have now from an acting perspective that is like a Newman or a Redford, where you literally make the movie so we can say Paul Newman in The Verdict, or another great film, by the way, or Robert Redford in some of his starring vehicles, and I'll break down some of them here, some recommendations for you. But that the movie exists is iconically defined by the performance of this person. I'm not saying we don't have great actors now. We have incredible actors Mark Ruffalo, just to name one, on task currently. So we have some very, very talented actors, but there's something else in being a movie star, and the idea of making a movie like HUD, now I'm going to talk about Paul Newman again, that only exists because of the charisma, the particular iconography around that person. Brad Pitt kind of went for that in F1, but that could have been other characters as well, although definitely a star turn for him there. But I think it definitely worked. I think Tarantino is good at weaponizing someone's star charisma, and he likes these things as well. And I think you look at Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and that is Brad Pitt being that type of star, but only in that performance. So this idea of like having somebody who you basically would line up to go see what they do because they are in the movie is pretty rare. Like you don't go see an Avengers film because of the performers. There are some women, female actors today that still have some of this. Like you think about Cate Blanchett playing Lydia Tarr. That's like an iconic performance, although not in a massively mainstream movie, but it still has some of that. And because maybe all of these guys are all in these DC franchises or MCU franchises or Star Wars franchises, all these younger actors now, they in all these IP, that they don't have that same kind of persona anymore. One person who definitely represents this in a positive way would be Tom Cruise, but not anymore, even there. So Tom Cruise, when you think about him in The Color of Money, or speaking of Paul Newman again, or even in something like as silly as Cocktail, which really wouldn't work at all without his charisma. But then you think about him in Collateral, you think about him in Magnolia. These are performances that are magnetic and so digging into, like accentuating his own star persona. And you see something as toxic as Magnolia, but you see something as positive as Jerry Maguire. All these films that really only work with a star turn, and probably only his star turn. And as I mentioned, we see less and less of that. So anyway, I was thinking about this in the context of Paul Newman last year. So rare to have that type of career as a film, as a star anymore. And we need those stars, I think. I think that helps get people back to the movie theater. So we got to work on that. Who are the stars of the future? And through my rewatch and initial watch of some of these Paul Newman films, I couldn't help but consider Robert Redford as well. He was younger, Redford, of course, but also tried to create that type of career for himself. In many ways, using Newman as a mentor. And of course, now he's passed away, which made me think about his career yet again. So here is a pretty long list of recommendations for you. Okay, so if you're new to Robert Redford, you want to start with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. This is actually, Paul Newman is probably the more charismatic. I mean, two very charismatic leads, of course, but it's really Newman's film. But you have to see this because you see that this is Redford very young. He's only had his breakout just a couple of years earlier, and immediately hitting the ground running. Very intriguingly, right in the film itself, you have this mentor and this younger man, the Paul Newman character, the Robert Redford, in a lot of ways paralleling them as movie stars themselves. This well-established, at the peak of his career, Newman, and of course, this young up-and-comer with Redford. And I also love this movie. I like this better than The Sting, by the way, which is my second recommendation. I know most people prefer The Sting. It's got the big twist in it. It's a lot of fun. I love a heist movie. I agree with all that stuff. It is a template in so many ways for like an Ocean's 11 type movie or just that genre of film. Of course, there were heist films before then, but the massive, I mean, when The Sting came out, it was one of the most popular films worldwide in history. And it still holds up now. Extremely entertaining. But for my money, I actually prefer the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which I was so surprised when I saw it. I had avoided it when I was just first getting into movies because people said, that's a pretty traditional Western. It's just a star vehicle. And then I finally watched it and I found it so fascinating because it was so popular, but it was right on the cusp of the rejection of Westerns by Americans, where it wasn't as sarcastic and ironic as the Leone films were, like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, for example, which came out the same year. So it was more traditional, but yet there was some commentary there. It was like it was presented in a more traditional way. It had this really fun buddy dynamic, but it seemed to have a self-awareness that what you were being seen was just a fantasy version of the West. So without being an anti-Western, which became more popular throughout the 70s and 80s, it was still self-aware, still commenting on the illusion, of course, with these two stars in it, this artificiality of the story that was being told. And I thought it was really smart, really beautiful, great star turns. So do check out Butch Cassidy if you've never seen it or if you haven't seen it in a long time. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Of course, Sundance Kid is Robert Redford, who eventually started the Sundance Film Festival, and obviously Sundance, very important to him. He used it right in the name of his film festival. And like I mentioned, if you want to make it a double feature, then The Sting, Paul Newman, and Robert Redford once again. Redford now, his star has risen, he's more established, and now they're more on equal footing. Again, a great buddy film in a completely different genre, but a real blast. If you've never seen that, you definitely got to check it out. Another double feature from the 70s, if you want to keep it rolling. Two paranoid conspiracy thrillers that were released in back-to-back years. 3 Days of the Condor, in which Robert Redford, who is a CIA operative who just is like the librarian at the CIA, stumbles upon a conspiracy and finds out that his life is at risk. And him and Faye Dunaway, both looking incredible, of course, fall into this romance as they're on the run from this cabal of conspirators. And then just 1 year later, another paranoid conspiracy thriller, All the President's Men, with Dustin Hoffman, which is, of course, based on an actual conspiracy, the Watergate cover-up. You know, he had a lot of misses in his career, but he made a lot of movies and had a lot of hits in there as well. But one I want to bring everyone's attention back to, if you haven't seen it in a long time, back in 1992, Sneakers, a film that I watched when I was a kid, that I just remember this was another one of those perennial cable films that everybody watched at this period of time. And these hackers, when hackers were just starting to have a cultural moment, benevolent hackers that are trying to take down yet another conspiracy that they've stumbled into when they pick up what they think is just a pretty clean corporate data retrieval task, which spirals out of control. And then another very fun movie as they try to get out of this circumstance and protect themselves at the same time. In a way, another type of heist film, a lot of fun. Of course, he's also a director, even in films that he didn't appear in. Just some of the films he directed. Ordinary People, which won Best Picture. We're just talking about Task here. And of course, in a very different milieu, not a lower class Pennsylvania, but like an upper crust, blue blood, New England family, but how a death in the family devastates the relationships in that family. Still a really powerful and disturbing movie from all the way back in 1980. A River Runs Through It, which was part of the ascension of Brad Pitt. Really, I think he saw a lot of his particular star charisma in Pitt and helped him a couple of times throughout the course of his career. Very early on, directing him in A River Runs Through It. And The Horse Whisperer, in which he appears as well. This movie's a little too long, but I love A Horse Whisperer, the Horse Whisperer, by the way. And I love his performance in there. And it really was something he came around to later in his career. I mean, it's funny because that's 1998. Scarlett Johansson in there giving a great performance, very young in her career as well. But it's funny that in 98, I thought he was late in his career, and then he continued to make movies for like another 20 years. Beyond the films he's directed, another double feature, one last double feature I would recommend from late in his career. Two films that I don't think have been seen by enough people. Yes, towards the end of his career, he even made Marvel films. Yeah, of course, there was a whole cycle where everybody had to be in a Marvel film. But the two films I want to point out are 2013's All Is Lost, where he gives a very physical performance, nearly wordless, a survival story, This Man on His Boat, directed and written by J.C. Chandor, by the way, who until very recently had a very stellar early career trajectory for him. And the whole premise of it is that he is trapped on this boat in a storm, and it's simply him just trying to survive and constantly improvising, constantly thinking. Speaking of like that star charisma, you can see with almost no dialogue at all, Redford's actual thought process as he gets himself out of one situation to the other. And it's just the camera on his face as he is making these decisions. Very physical, by the way. He like lost hearing in one ear. You see him tumbled inside this boat set. He's out in the water for a period of this as well. A tough physical performance for him. He was in his 70s at this point, just about 10 years ago. So in his late 70s, great performance and a terrific movie too, by the way. All Is Lost. And then in 2018, a film that for me did not work as well, another talented director who's much more hit and miss for me, David Lowery. And this movie's called The Old Man and the Gun. And this got like unanimous praise when it came out. When I saw it, I thought the film itself was a little mundane, a little flat. It didn't really grip me. I liked it. It was okay, but it didn't really grab me the way that I had expected given some of the reviews. But the one thing that's a real standout is, of course, Redford playing this old man who's been in and out of jail, and he's trying to settle down. And it's a really fascinating look at this character, and not only like just someone who's aging in general. It's almost like it is Redford reflecting on his own career. You could almost read it as this is a Sundance Kid type character who now late in his career just doesn't have the juice anymore, but still craves it. Just one last great performance from him. If you are a big Redford fan, or if you want to see more of him, just seeing him in this late stage in his career, still incredibly charismatic. And by the way, that's like 7 years, maybe 7 years ago now. Still looked great back then. So, I mean, I don't know what he passed away of, but seemed to be very healthy towards the end of his life. But I mean, hey, 89, something's going to get you. But what a career he had. Of course, Sundance, the film festival as well. The whole culture of indie cinema, Sundance to a large extent popularized that brand of lesser seen cinema and really created a marketplace for it. So really transformed the movie industry as well throughout the 80s and 90s and up to this very day. Although Sundance is not as big as it used to be, there's a lot of other film festivals as well. But still, Sundance used to be a very important moment for launching films. And yet another thing that he did for the film culture in general. But there are so many other films I could recommend. I'm just going to briefly mention a few more. Jeremiah Johnson, this great psychedelic Western from 1972. Not fully psychedelic, more like psychedelic for the fact that just these incredible vistas, it's almost like just being lost in this wilderness is a psychedelic experience in and of itself. Again, not near wordless, but sparsely worded performance on his part, in 72, showing that charisma he had natively, even when he doesn't have to give a lot of dialogue. Although there are some pretty long-winded passages in that film too. But a great modernist Western, once again, on the cusp of being not an anti-Western, but it's a traditional Western that nonetheless questions the existing mythology around the Western at that period of time. And also from 1972, a film called The Candidate. Terrific film. If you've never seen it, it's about this guy who is just, on TV, very charismatic. And they're like, that guy should run for office. And you see over the course of the film how step by step by step, he's more and more and more compromised by the machinery of running for office and being part of a party and, having to raise money, and more trenchant today than it ever was before. And that's The Candidate. Definitely check that out if you've never seen it. He's got some very popular romances, The Way We Were with Barbra Streisand, Out of Africa with Meryl Streep. Another romance, a romance for baseball, The Natural, if you've never seen that. If you're a baseball fan, it's just one of those films that kind of tries to capture the magic of what makes baseball special. So if you're really into baseball, I'm sure you've seen that one before. And he still had big hits even later in his career. The absolutely silly Indecent Proposal, a very popular film, of course. And working right up to the end of his career, even directing occasionally as well, and producing many films. And showing up in Avengers Endgame, one of the biggest films of all times. So quite a career. We should also be so lucky to have the kind of legacy that he left behind. If you haven't seen any of those films, do catch up on at least some of them. I'm sure there'll be some Robert Redford marathon on one of those networks this very weekend. Okay, so to get into the episode breakdown, Alien Earth, Episode 7, Emergence. Did I say last week was my least favorite episode of Alien Earth? I'm pretty sure I did. Well, I think we have a new contender. But as usual, with a lot of the criticism I've had of the show so far this year, there are still some really outstanding aspects to this show. As things begin in the episode, we see that excellently played by the way, great performances around across the board here, by Adarsh Gaurav, is in his room trying to hide Arthur's body, who loudly is breathing. I didn't know that these things breathe so loudly. Maybe I missed that in the previous Alien movies. And he's tucked him under the bed, Arthur, that is. These bladders are breathing for him. He's unconscious, as is the norm for these people who have been face-hugged. Whenever any kind of movement to the body, we see the tail tightening around the neck, as we've seen in other Alien iterations. And Slightly is talking to Arthur, being like, hey, are you thirsty? Let me try to get my juice box in there in your mouth. And of course, the alien does not like this at all. At one point, when he's pushing those fingers apart and you hear things cracking, I was actually worried that he was going to snap one of those fingers off and that acid blood would come out and kill poor Arthur. I mean, Arthur's doomed anyway, it doesn't matter. But what's interesting here is that there's an element of horror to this, obviously, but honestly, this is very comedic. This is a pretty funny sequence, and it's almost like this whole episode itself, from a script level, is mostly comedic sequences one after the other, which is not in the tone of the direction of the show. So this particular thing wasn't working for me. The silliness of some of these situations and the very intentional comedy, physical comedy of what we were seeing, counterpoint pointed to the very serious stakes of the episode. I've mentioned how there are like Easter eggs here for everything in previous Alien films. I guess this, once again, is another thing that makes it feel like Alien Resurrection, by the way, which is maybe the least successful or one of the least successful of all those Alien films. And in the same way that didn't quite work for me, at least that tone was more consistent to allow it to go a little outlandish. There's been no indication in the tone of this show that we should go slapstick. So it's weird. It just didn't rub me the right way. Poor Arthur here, of course, a real moral center, as we've mentioned before, of the show, who honestly is pretty indignantly gotten rid of here. I mean, we will touch on it here, but he does get to be aware and try to reconnect us, as he's been covered by this facehugger and kind of sidelined, except for a couple of plot points earlier in the middle of the season, I should say. But trying to reconnect us empathetically as viewers to his character here, I feel, again, I'm starting right with the criticisms, but I feel like it's a little too little to reestablish that relationship with him. Smee shows up and busts into the room. He knows immediately something's wrong. Smee, played by Jonathan Ajayi, and again, doing an excellent job of embodying this childish, just his physicality of it as well. As good as these actors are at performing this, and we've already touched on this previously on our recaps here, I do find it a little questionable that they have remained, so many of the cast members here have remained so childish when we see, for example, that Wendy has truly, and maybe this is in the plot itself, that part of Kid Cavalier's interest in her is in knowing that she has this thing that maybe a certain quality they've been looking for, that she can evolve, that growing into her lobster shell more so than these other characters can. Because we see over and over again in this particular episode that whether it is the overt childishness of some of these characters, or even characters that we thought, like Curly, would be also stepping up their game to some extent, again show this very childish, or at least maybe their adolescent behavior, and we don't really see signs of this true intellectual evolution outside of the Wendy character. And again, we see that Cavalier did seem to pinpoint her as his greatest interest. So maybe there is something uniquely about her, and maybe this explains, and maybe we'll get an explanation to this, this will explain the mystery I was trying to solve, this conundrum of why do we even need human brains inside of these transferred bodies, when theoretically you could establish an artificial intelligence, of course, but maybe there is something uniquely human, but only with some humans. So I'm trying to give the show the benefit of the doubt here that her evolution is more profound because of something that they've been actually seeking in these candidates. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, but as we open the sequence, the Strange Brew sequence at the beginning, that does this little quick recap of things up to this point, or at least of the previous episode. Most of it are these horrific images, this fetishization of the sleek, dynamic body of the full-blown xenomorph, and then intercut with the alien sheep hybrid, another hybrid, as slightly gets Smee to participate with him to bring the body to the beach. Apparently that is where he has planned to meet with Morrow. Kirsch has returned to the lab. Very interesting, all of these, what happens in the lab here. First of all, they very quickly contain the situation, just speaking to the fact that, like, why didn't Kirsch, when he saw what was happening, announce this ahead of time? One argument is that he was allowing for this thing to go really badly because he has another agenda, which apparently he did. But you feel like once things were set in motion, he could have just called ahead, because they get this thing pretty contained pretty quickly. And he does seem to, in his own way, mourn the loss of Isaac here. Toodles. Kid can't remember that his name is actually Isaac. He has to remind him it's Toodles. I was very confused last week, like what were these flies eating when they were dissolving poor Toodles' head? And the theory here is that these bugs can actually digest minerals because they live on such an arid planet. So the reason they weren't touching that other food was because they didn't want something organic. They wanted something inorganic. And unfortunately, Isaac was it. You know who did make this observation? Mr. Sheep/Alien, the most charismatic character in this whole show. By the way, I call total BS on when they're watching the security camera, where it's cutting to close-ups of the flies on the rafters and then the flies on Isaac's arm and stuff. This would be a stationary camera, people. None of this makes any sense. Wendy shows up and she's starting to realize that, everything we speculated on last week, that the show is probably really the fulcrum of the show is going to be what decision does Wendy make? Who does she side with? Is made explicitly clear here, right? She walks into the lab. She sees that Isaac's been sacrificed. They seem like, hey, this just comes with the territory. The alien is there somehow communicating with her. And when they try to keep her from leaving because they don't want her to tell the other hybrids what's happened, she reminds them that she has a new pet alien, the xenomorph. She is now on board with leaving with her brother, but she wants to take the other hybrids with her. Nibs, despite being reset, is on board with going. They have to manipulate her a little bit, but she's on board with going. She doesn't accept the fact that her memory's been erased, but she still is obsessed that you can't control the things that are inside my body. Her disassociation continues, of course, so the reset didn't really help. I'm not sure how it's going to pay off plot-wise yet, other than just the way she behaves later in this particular episode. Curly is still brainwashed by the Kid Cavalier party line. She says it's the best place she's ever lived, and she doesn't want to go anywhere else. She does reluctantly not rat them out, though, as they try to make their escape. And then, speaking of Wendy making a decision as to who she's siding with, she releases the alien in the lab. And of course, the alien starts tearing apart the security staff that's there. People have now become disposable in Wendy's mind. Oh, they've noticed, of course, along the way that the security has been turned off. They cannot view from the POV of the hybrids. They know this is Arthur's doing. And when they go and talk to Dame Sylvia, she's unaware of this. And of course, they think he just was fired, and that's why he's disappeared temporarily. And then more comedic moments here as the military security is working its way through the hallways, preparing to track down all the hybrids, try to contain the alien and any other unforeseen circumstances. Slightly and Smee are trying to escape with Arthur's body. They run into Kirsch, who says, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "Oh, you don't understand. I'm being blackmailed." And he's like, "Oh, no, I know all that. I'm asking you, why are you going that way? You're supposed to go this way." Of course, illustrating once again what we've seen so many times before. What is Kirsch's actual agenda? And we finally know what it is here by the end of this episode, by the way. It's just extremely cold-blooded. Meanwhile, Wendy and Curly and Joe find the burial site of the children's actual bodies. Wendy intriguingly says, "It's not us, we're still here." And Nib simply just says, "It's not us at all." So this interesting lack of acceptance of the physical reality, and then a more philosophical perspective from Wendy/Marcy. I do like that we are now in the wilds of Thailand here where they've shot this. They did not take advantage of this locale enough, but we do get to see this very lush scenery, at least temporarily. I guess, I'm presuming here, just a guess here, that the finale will be a blend of both of these. There'll be a lot of interiors, because we do go back into the buildings by the end of this episode, but I assume there will also be some kind of escape. So we will be back in this lush scenery again, but certainly feels like they have underused this to this point. More comedy here, about to be set up with tragedy, where Arthur comes awake, and at first they cannot find out where he is. Where did he go? Then they find the face hugger. Of course, they're not familiar how this thing works. The face hugger has fallen off, and he's now walking around. So for the moment, at least, Slightly probably feels pretty good about this. Oh, he's right. I didn't hurt Arthur, actually. Arthur forgot. I'm not sure how this works, by the way, that I guess this is the same in the first Alien film as well. You come to again, and you have lost memory of some of the events. Obviously, anything they were, they're truly in a coma while they have the facehugger on them. But he even seems to be unclear of the final moments before the attack. They finally make it to the beach, and Arthur is seeing more and more, remembering more and more of what happened at the end, and starts to know something's very wrong. And he's piecing it together. And also these kids, they're not very practiced at lying. You have to learn how to lie, and these kids are not very good liars. And eventually he just says, look, I know something's wrong, but we can fix it. He takes both their hands, again showing us the kind person that Arthur really is. Maybe the one remaining morally uncompromised character on the show. And of course, he gets chest bursted. We knew it was going to come. It goes skittering into the grass next to the beach. Slightly, he's like knocking the grass over. Where did it go? Where did it go? He desperately needs this, of course. And even though, this is on its face completely screwed up, obviously. This is a failed attempt, to say the least. They still continue with this. They take Arthur's body without the alien in it, obviously, and still goes to make his rendezvous. When he arrives there, there is a SEAL team there led by Murrow. And Murrow says, target 1 is a failure, but on to target 2. Target 2, of course, is inside of the compound. We take a little break from that to go back into the lab where Kid Cavalier is trying to communicate with the sheep alien. He writes the first 3 digits of pi and goes, what are the next digits? Let's see how smart this thing is. The sheep is actually trying to talk to him. And he says, I know what we need to do. We need to put it into a person. I like Adam, by the way, here, his assistant, who is basically trying to talk him out of this the whole entire time. And eventually just says, okay, I guess that's what we're doing next. So finally, we will see the alien in a human host. Who will be the human host remains to be seen. Maybe I'll speculate on that by the end, at the end of our recap here. I'll start a list, he says, by the way. Very funny. More comedy here, by the way. The big pooping sheep, the poop joke and the sheep. A lot of comedy here interspersed with these things that should not be comedic. For example, Arthur's death. And then, of course, we get to the end, which is not comedic either. Wendy, Joe, and Nibs are close to getting to the boat for their escape when they are surrounded by Prodigy security staff. And again, a lot of comedy here. First of all, as they approach, Nibs hisses at them and they all back up, put their guns back up. And the alien comes dropping out of the trees and attacks, apparently sicked on them by Mama Marcy/Wendy herself. Eventually, it runs back into the woods and Joe asks, what did you tell it to do? And she says, I told it to follow and watch, I think. So a lot of comedy here in a very strange routine. A couple of things. I'm just going to get into the criticism right here. This is, like I mentioned, pretty disappointed in the direction this show has gone, and especially in this episode, despite some of the enjoyment I'm representing here and recapping it. But when the alien comes, beautifully done, by the way, but when the alien in, a man in a bodysuit, very impressively done, like practically, comes dropping out of those trees, there's elements of the show, of course, that I've thought many times this feels like Blade Runner more than Alien. We've mentioned that before. But at this moment, when they're in this forest and there is an alien dropping from the trees on top of these military men, I'm thinking Predator. Is that really the analogy we want to be making? And here's an analogy you don't want to hear, everybody. You know what I'm really thinking? I'm thinking Jurassic World. Are these like velociraptors now? And Blue can be like trained to attack? I don't want to be thinking about Jurassic World when I'm watching this show, but that is exactly what I'm thinking about. When Murrow returns to the compound with his team in tow, as he enters, there are many, many more guns pointed at him. Of course, Timothy Oliphant, great as always, stealing every scene he's in. Murrow immediately points the gun at Slightly's head, and Kirsch has much to say this. First, he says, no one likes a sore loser, so he puts the gun down. He shows them that he has the alien, and he says, finders keepers. And then, of course, he says, get over here, boys. And the boys run behind them again, like we saw earlier in the season itself. He says, the two of you are grounded. Interestingly, though, Murrow says this is not over, and Kirsch says nothing ever is. And then some more comedic action here at the end of the episode. Nibs, fully reverted to a little angry girl with her stuffed animal, has it taken away and thrown into the water by one of Joe's coworkers. They're upset with Joe, like, why are you doing this? He goes, I have to get out of here. You don't understand what's going on. They're surrounded by these security detail. Wendy tears the jaw right off of this guy who messed with her stuffed animal and seems to be really gleeful about it afterwards. And Wendy is using less lethal force, but still pretty brutal. And she's about to call the alien to come and wipe out this entire force when Joe uses this electricity gun, which disables Nibs, hopefully only temporarily. I have a feeling this is only temporary because we want to see Nibs go full crazy next week. And Wendy says, what did you do? What did you do? So at that moment, she could still call the alien, but she doesn't because she knows her brother's still in harm's way. But how long is that going to prevent her from making a choice to align herself with this alien even more so? And we end with Song of the Dead, I believe, from Songs for the Deaf, the album from Queens of the Stone Age. Didn't see Queens of the Stone Age coming, not on my bingo card. And now let me get into my criticism here. First of all, I thought that the episode itself, other than the comedy, really was not what I expected at this point in the show. And now I'm going to start sounding like some of the folks who were critical of the series early on, and I was defending it. That Alien, by definition, is not a franchise that sits around talking about existential themes. Those existential themes emerge from the fact of being stalked by some killer insect that cannot be bargained with on some inhospitable ship or planet. So it's about accepting the fact that inevitably all these people are going to die. And then it makes you ask these questions. What makes life worth living beyond survival, and how these creatures are so good at survival. But it's not really something that has to be narrated or spoken or parsed out by the characters themselves. It's just ingrained in the circumstance of the films. And I think that's what makes the franchise work from film to film. Some better than others, of course. So, of course, in this particular case, we have these synthetics who are not humans, and in that way, the stakes are so fundamentally different than they are when we have humans fearing for their mortal lives. It's very different when even theoretically here, there's a whole conversation about whether it would be possible to reboot Isaac, Toodles. And then even the alien itself as this primal killing force is now just one of a menagerie of aliens. And some of those aliens, like the sheep alien, which we still know so little about, are in so many ways more interesting than the story of the alien itself. And then to have the alien, which symbolically is the symbol of inevitable death, be turned into, Murrow can avoid the attacks of it by simply being able to control his heart rate. Maybe it's just misunderstood here, and because of a little TLC, and it's can be your best friend. It very much feels like the Velociraptors in Jurassic World, as I mentioned before. Is this really the direction we want them to take this monster? Maybe this is all subversion. Maybe the monster in the end is truly the monster. As a matter of fact, next week's episode is called The Real Monsters, which I think are humans, by the way, in the opinion of this show. So I don't think the real monsters are the aliens. It's the people. But once again, because of that, it really undermines the whole idea of what the alien threat truly is. But I still am curious to see how they particularly land this story, and if they can somehow take some of these misgivings I've outlined here. And honestly, with this particular episode, I feel like some of the directionality of the storyline, some of the diffusing of the threat of the alien, and the focus on too much on the different, these interesting philosophical questions about humanity and AI and this hybrid and other species as well, and different forms of intelligence, and what wins in the end, what will survive at some point in the distant future, and will humans by definition end up destroying themselves? All those questions really fascinating and actually pretty well explored here along the way. But I really feel like the highlight of the season was also what derailed the season to some extent. Being on that ship, going back and having that moment of pure alienness in that episode in space. No One, I think it's called. As satisfying as that was from the POV of giving us the alien film we wanted to see, I mean, since then, when we came back, a lot of the affinity I had with these different characters has been diluted, to say the least. I was very intrigued to say, how is it going to play out, this tug of war for kids' affection between the different kids, specifically Curly versus Wendy. All of that just seemed to kind of pop with that change of focus. And now we come back, we get really, like I mentioned before, just this rudimentary paint by numbers, point to point, getting us setting up the next season. And honestly, going from what was set up last week, which was already set up, to what inevitably is going to come next week, and in the most rote way possible. That there is really no surprises here at all. We are very curious to be like, what is Kirsch's grand scheme? And one of the possibilities was he's just letting this play out to lure Murrow in, and then he can capture Murrow. And now, hey, look, we got him dead to rights. This was some kind of attack, this violation, corporate violation by one of the other companies. And aha, I caught him. And of course, it's pretty cold and calculated that he was willing to kill many people there. I mean, it seems that he didn't necessarily expect Wendy to release the alien, for example. That seemed to catch him off guard. But he also didn't seem to care that much because he's like, well, you got to break a few eggs. These are a few more eggs than I expected. But hey, this is a very cold and calculating plan, but also the simplest explanation for some of the behavior, which is to say that what was intriguing earlier on is kind of just resolved itself in relatively unsatisfying ways. In a nutshell, I can be critical of the whole entire episode and this whole entire project to a large extent. In the chest burster scene itself, it is winking back at the original film and the chest burster scene there. We even have like the white t-shirt on, so to accentuate it. But that chest burster scene is like one of those most shocking scenes in movie history for anybody who experienced it in real time. But even now, when you sit there and you watch it, the way it builds up, the anticipation, it knows that every time you watch it with somebody new, it's going to make them jump. And now you always are surprised at how long it takes and how mundane the conversation becomes before things turn bad. So you are directly, in this case of this show, directly reminding everybody of that. And if you listen to the filmmaker talking about this, she mentions that they had all the details down and it took a long time to produce and it was all done practically, and they copied some of the framing from the original film. But if you see it here, it's so rushed that it is like a foregone conclusion. And it just kind of speaks to what I think in as an example of itself, the misgivings I have around the project itself. Just the idea that, okay, we're going to recreate it slavishly, but it's not going to have the impact it did before. So theoretically, you want to, in my opinion, I think anyway, you want to create something that feels different, but reminds you of that thing, instead of just recreating it, but then rushing through it, like really not adding anything to the value proposition of including it. So it's really disappointing to a large extent how little impact that particular scene has when it is like one of the most iconic moments. I mean, basically, the simplest way I can say it is that if you watch the first Alien film, you would never skip that scene. It would always have an impact as you watch it now. And when you watch this scene, like, you're never going to go back and be like, oh man, I got to go see that chest burster scene in the penultimate episode of the show. It didn't really have that power to it at all. And they even try to build up our empathy for the Arthur character, reconnecting him to this paternalistic view and knowing the kid so well and all that. It still just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And now I'm at a point where I'm not certain of how things will play out in the finale, and I don't really care. I mentioned this last week, but my lack of empathy for these characters, I mean, I guess I care a little bit that Dame Sylvia maybe survives, but she's pretty morally compromised. These kids, they're probably more danger than they are anything else. And the fact that Kid Cavalier has allowed these kids to be put into these very dangerous situations, losing himself billions of dollars. Again, by the way, billions of dollars for these individual creations. 100 years from now, a couple $1 billion, $6 billion, whatever it was, is not really that much money. So they should have made these numbers much larger. But even there, of course, the cruelty that he's imposing on these children, but once again, the unavoidable Peter Pan parallels in that story, as I mentioned in last week's recap. Peter Pan actually, when the kids start to grow up, he thins them out. Although he looks like he doesn't seem to mind, other than maybe a little bit financially, the loss of the individual lost boys themselves, he does still have some curiosity about what is happening with Wendy and her relationship with these aliens. And I guess that's the only kind of intriguing aspect of what is happening, the relationship between Wendy, the xenomorph, and what, of course, maybe the only thing that I'm truly excited for next week is hearing from the alien. Like, what's it going to say once it's inside of a human body? And who are they going to put it into? Is it going to be Murrow? Murrow's probably a bad idea because Murrow has some heavy artillery attached to his arms. They should just get Joe Schmo, military dude from the other side, and plug in this alien and see what it says. But I'm very curious to hear what its agenda is. And maybe all this is going to be satisfying. Maybe that alien is going to be truly revelatory and explain the nature of these aliens and unlock this whole entire season. But my level of confidence in that has been greatly diminished. Murrow doesn't get a lot to do this week, but can't wait for him and Kirsch to face off next week, inevitably. Of course, going to be the big battle royale we were waiting for to see these two duke it out. That alien going into somebody's head is going to trigger Nibs for sure, and God knows what's going to happen when she sees that. She's really going to go off the deep end. And honestly, as a fan of Queens of the Stone Age, of a lot of their catalog, I don't really get the needle drop here at the end. And as a matter of fact, it makes me very skeptical towards all of these needle drops at the end of these episodes, which we have just been laughing along with and curious about and really don't know what this adds. And again, just this distraction of just throwing these songs in there. And like I said, this isn't even one of the worst songs they've had. I've enjoyed most of the songs they've had at the end here, but it just seems to be just at this point some arbitrary song that he likes, that Noah Hawley likes, because I don't know if it adds anything thematically to the shows here at all. And that's just an example of these weird, thematic elements being shoehorned together, of these tones now, especially in this episode, this tone just really not coalescing with this comedy, a lot of comedy, which isn't very funny because of the dour tone of the show. And then hard to pivot from a bunch of people being torn apart to what's supposedly a joke in the next scene. And that's where we leave things for next week. Does Murrow have a grander scheme that is going to fall into place after this failed attempt? It doesn't seem to be. It seems to be that this was the full plan that he outlined last week anyway. The alien is still out and about. Wendy can control it. Wendy's heading back in there. Basically, everybody is. They have, for the moment, contained things, except for the alien. The alien's a wild card, and if it can communicate with Wendy, or Wendy can shepherd it indoors, one very simple way this plays out is and very much like an alien film, the alien just simply gets back inside, starts tearing people apart. But in this case, she can control it to some extent, at least. Will Joe end up dead? Maybe. Maybe she can't keep the alien from being as the primitive creature that it is. Will she have to kill the alien because she can't control it in the end? That's another possible interesting moral quandary here. Will she choose the alien over her brother? That would be a shocking twist, of course. But I don't think it's going to be that simple. Of course, we have the whole Nibs situation that is still going to pay off in some way. The alien has got to pay off in some significant way. It's just been teased the entire time. Oh, and I keep forgetting this again and again. How does the plant-looking alien pay off? It's still there. They reminded us that it was there just last week. There's some additional payoff coming from that. It's been hiding in plain sight this whole entire time. There might be more to that creature as well, and maybe even a relationship between that creature and this one. So these are the mysteries for next week. And at the same time, it seems like this episode was just setting up and didn't have enough payoff. But then what I just outlined there seems to be too much to cover in a finale. So I guess we'll have to wait and see if they can stick the landing. I have to tell you right now, just doing this recap has made me like the episode more than when I watched it. But as I was watching it, I was not very satisfied, I have to say. So I'm glad I did this because it made me like the show a little bit better. And hopefully next week when I talk to Darren, we'll get a good episode, and that conversation will improve the show as well, I hope. Okay, so everybody stay tuned. Black Rabbit coming this Thursday to Netflix. I might be recapping it over the weekend, maybe. Depends on if I have time or not. So maybe a bonus episode this week, if possible. Another episode of Task. Expect that on Sunday night, and our recap on Monday. And then next week, The Lowdown, Alien Earth finale, The Return of Slow Horses, and The Savant. That's right. All that next week. Thanks for listening, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.